All right. It can be very informal, and I don't have any expectations from this. It's just a way for me to get some thoughts out to help me. I'm trying to write something, and thought this was going to be a good way to sort of work some of the thoughts out. So, all opinions are my own. But no, I wanted to sort of start this first thing off by just talking about the meaning of a song that I wrote called Insomniac Fiend, because it's about consciousness, which is something I like to think about. Yeah, don't we all, though? I mean, Um, and and so just to get right into it, I think about consciousness on a spectrum from the sleeping machine to the insomniac fiend, and so that's kind of what I'm talking about in the song. Um, and so the sleeping machine is going to be somebody that is essentially just working off of, I guess, what I call body computations. It's it's not quite the autonomic nervous system, right? Because that's more commonly thought of as the peripheral nervous system, but it's the unconscious, it's the subconscious, which can be programmed by the conscious, and whatever you're doing when you're not thinking about it directly. So I like to use the example of, as we all know, as musicians, anybody that's tried to sort of learn a piece, you're essentially just programming your body so you don't have to think about it when you're playing it, right? And in fact, you can actually screw yourself up if you think about it too much when you're playing it. Certainly, I do that often. We call it getting in your head, right? um, so the sleeping machine is the sort of extreme example of an unconscious being, um, that has the capacity of being conscious, but sort of has turned it off. Maybe you could think of it as a zone state individual would probably be in that. And then the insomniac fiend is a hyper conscious or a hyper aware individual. And so this is probably where it helps to explain a little bit more about this. So when I think of consciousness, just defining it, I think of it kind of fundamentally as self awareness, having a concept of yourself. Um, and to do that, you need to sort of create, I think, what's his name? Hofstadter calls it like a strange loop. It's like you're looping your thought onto yourself, in a strange and almost paradoxical way. And so, in saying all this, you can, or at least I think about consciousness as first having, um, the dimension of time is almost, I think, an inherent quality that comes out of a conscious individual. And so, like, the sleeping machine is not necessarily aware of time because you're just living in the present. And then, as soon as a being becomes aware, you start to extrapolate into not the present. You could sort of classify, but then you can break that not present up into a future and a past. And then as you project, and by projection, I just mean, thinking about things. That's kind of what I mean when I say projection. As you project into this not present state, you can do so in more and more extravagant ways until, you're completely out of yourself and, you're completely out of the present and you're just sort of working in your mental projections. And so I call this the insomniac fiend because it's like, if the sleeping machine is the one extreme, then the insomniac fiend is sort of the completely awake individual, so much so that they're fiendish. Because if you go kind of too far in either direction, I feel like you have a propensity for pathology, shall we say, whether it's anxiety for the insomniac fiend. And so I kind of think of anxiety as a very fundamental pathology of an aware individual, which I think is why we have so much uh, anxiety, an anxiety epidemic, or maybe even pandemic, dare I say, on our hands, because we have sort of a world that's full of more aware individuals than ever before. Um, and I sort of think of depression as a subset of anxiety, actually. Um, because I think about it just as sort of these pathologic feedback loops. And pathologic feedback loops are just projections that, you can't stop. You can't stop projecting into these abstractions. And, you know, so, yeah, okay, so I just said a lot of things there, so I'll unpack some of it too. So I talk about David Hartley in the song because this is kind of where a lot of this thinking stems from. It stems from the associationist philosophy. So associationism was, I feel like, it's probably what most neuroscientists would subscribe to without potentially realizing it. Or, maybe they do, but they maybe don't know the history completely. I mean, I didn't even really, but so associationism is just this idea that the brain is forming the mind from associating things together. And but an associationist specifically would think that you're forming the mind based off of the sensory perceptions. So I have a line, sensory perception is the base, and this comes from David Hartley's writing, who I think, is really John Locke and maybe even Aristotle were the first person to really sort of think about this, but it's the idea that the mind is a blank slate, and then it becomes something as you start to bring in sensorial information. And then, so the sensorial information is the most rudimentary thought. And then you build up abstract thoughts. David Hartley calls them intellectual thoughts. You build them up by basically associating sensorial thoughts, and then you can associate the intellectual thoughts too, and then just build these crazy abstractions until you have a mind. And so yeah, that's a very sort of surface level explanation of that. And Aristotle and John Locke, sort of put up, I think, the first thinkings of that. And then David Hartley basically just took those ideas and added Newton's idea of vibrations as a way of transmitting information, which was actually Newton's idea. The idea that neurons are transmitting information via vibrations, which, they were thinking more mechanical, but it's not completely crazy. I mean, the way we understand it now is neurons communicate via electrical oscillations, which is, a vibration in some sense. So, I think they had a lot of their thinking in the right spot. And then, and so I should say, I don't completely agree with the tabula rasa idea of like a blank slate, because I think, just genetics sort of makes it evident that it's not, you're not going off of nothing when you start. But I think the point is still not a bad one. That, or I should say, I still do I subscribe to the idea that senses are the sort of most fundamental idea that you have. And I do also subscribe to the idea that you're building off of more abstract projections based off of these. I mean, just think about thinking. And when you think about thinking, most of the time you're using a sensorial sort of concept to do it, whether you're imagining something that's visual stimulus, right? Or you could be hearing something and there's your auditory. So yeah. Yeah. So what else do I want to say? I feel like, okay, so I can talk a little bit about this, but I feel like if I do, I should say, this isn't medical, advice or anything like that. This is more just kind of how I think about things. I think that it seems pretty evident that you build off the mind, and consciousness is built or bootstrapped off of language. Excuse me. And so that's why I think we have more aware individuals now, because we sort of have more literate people than we ever did before. This is a little bit complicated because it gets into this question of how do you verify consciousness, and ultimately we rely on language to do that, which is why it brings up all these questions of like, just because we can't communicate with something doesn't necessarily mean it's not conscious. So, that comes up with animals, right? And I do, like I said, I think of consciousness as a spectrum, and do feel like it exists in some level in animals. So that's why this communication thing becomes a little bit tricky. But for our purposes, we all sort of, whenever we're conversing with people, we're taking this assumption that the other person is conscious, and we're doing that based off of their ability to communicate with us and sort of indicate self-awareness, or awareness of oneself. However you want to say it. It's all good. Yeah, so what was I saying? So I'm bringing this up because I feel like we have, you hear a lot about anxiety, where it's not that you didn't hear about it before, but I don't think you heard about it as much in past generations. And I think the reason is because we have just more aware people, or we have more people that are aware now. or perhaps we just have the ability, here's the other option, is we have just the ability to communicate our awareness to each other more. And this is all based off of social media, right? But I'm going to just, for the purpose of my argument, I'm going to just take it as it seems like it's mostly due to our ability, or just literacy, because, and so this is something else David Hartley talks about, is just, and not just him, but yeah, the Greeks and, the ancient Greeks, and, but the idea that, language is sort of how it plays this keyhole way of how we store information. And so then, getting back to what I was saying about what is consciousness inherently, it is projection out of the present. In order to project out of the present, you need to have some storage space to do those computations, and memory. So you need memory of some kind, and having language, I think, sort of facilitates memory, because it's like, so I'm getting ahead of myself. So, getting back, because I suppose I should talk about how do we think the brain is, so I brought up associationism. I brought up the idea that neuroscientists are probably, most modern neuroscientists are associationists, whether they or not they admit it. And it's because I think the sort of prevailing dogma of consciousness is that it resides in the interconnectivity of neurons. You have 82 billion neurons in the cortex, and it seems like information is stored distributedly within the connections of neurons. And I could go into a whole thing about that, but you could just look that up. You look up long-term potentiation if you want to read more about it. Look up the Hebbian model of memory if you want to learn about it. Look up the Hopfield network, is sort of how it was mathematically proven that you could store information within connections of things. And that's what all the neural nets, if you've heard about that, that's what all that is sort of based off of. Well, not based off of. I mean, it is and it isn't. It's like Hopfield wasn't the first guy to come up with the neural network, but he certainly put forth a very good, just one specific type of neural network that's used, the Hopfield network. Okay, so all of that is just to say that connections can store information, and this is what we think the brain is doing when it sort of is storing information. And so getting back to language, I'm thinking, it's a way to facilitate associations, because you have symbols. Language are symbols ultimately that you are storing sort of things with, and then you're facilitating. You don't need it, but it can facilitate a connection with many other things by acting as kind of a node, if that makes sense. And then you can sort of build complex ideas based off of these nodes by interchanging the nodes together. I don't know if this might be getting too abstract, and I don't know if it's necessarily necessary to go into, but and you know, you can disagree with this, but I think if you just think about it, it's like, what are you doing with language? And I think it's helping you build a concept of yourself. And but the other thing that's doing that as well is it just gets at this idea of memory is sort of the fundamental thing to also build up consciousness. So language can help facilitate memory, but you can have memory stored in other ways, like visual, you know, sort of like just remembering pictures. And so this is where I think social media comes in, whether you're not just necessarily reading a lot of stuff and potentially like past tweets about yourself or whatever, but you're also we have all these pictures of ourselves and we have all these videos of ourselves. All of this is helping everybody build up a self-concept of themselves. I've been recording myself like with music, I mean, you know, for 20 years now. And it's, you know, it's like that's just been slowly helping me develop a self concept. And so all of these things, I guess, is what I'm getting at, is contributing to more aware people, in my opinion. And awareness brings anxiety is kind of ultimately what I'm getting at, and what I opened with. So, because anxiety is just basically projection about stuff that can happen, you know, and it's particularly things that you might have some whatever like reservations about, or you know, some kind of, you know, that gut feeling, you know, it's so it's projecting. And so like I said, if you're projecting, you're conscious, and so if you're hyper aware, you're going to be projecting more, and you're going to be thinking about all these contingencies that could be happening. And then if you start focusing on a specific contingency, it can become programmed in your mind. And then I think that's where you get sort of pathological feedback loops that can progress to, you know, existential dread, depression, etc. Because this gets at this idea that the fundamental way that neurons are associating with each other is through repetition. You are, you know, if you fire a particular neuron onto another neuron and you do that repeatedly, you're going to build up the connection with that neuron. And if you build up the connection with that neuron, the next time you get that stimulus, it's going to fire at that neuron more easily. Like, and by fire, I mean it's going to discharge a neurotransmitter, probably glutamate, and it's going to more easily activate that other neuron to go activate other neurons to do whatever they're doing. So this is where I think, you know, we all kind of inherently think about triggers. It's a trigger. So, and again, I think we can kind of think about this very implicitly when we think about learning an instrument or something. Or what's a better example? Just like if you're singing a song and you can just get the beginning of the song and then you can remember the rest of the lyrics. It's like, it's because you've sort of keyholded, what am I talking? You know, you've keychained, you've hooked. You know, if you can get that one part going, you've hooked the rest of it. But it might be difficult to start in the middle, which is why if you want to learn something really well, you want to make sure that you can sort of start wherever it is, because then you know that you can sort of approach it from, you know, any sort of manner, if that makes sense. But guitar too, it's the same thing. Like I can think of millions of times where I've been learning a piece of music and if I can just remember how it starts and then sort of get out of my head, I can just let my fingers take over, because it has been programmed in a sense, but it's easy to sort of convince yourself that you don't have it. But anyway, so it's this idea that repetition is also, you know, that's fundamentally what I'm trying to get at. That repetition is the way that you program anything that is nervously, that is encoded by the nervous system. So whether it's musculoskeletal movement or it's just patterns within the brain, all of these are still fundamentally triggered by neurons. So just as you program your body to do certain movements when you're playing guitar, uh, you can, I'm getting at, you can program your mind in the same way. If you focus on something and you keep focusing on it, this is what behavioralism is. So this is why a lot of the behavioralists would also call themselves associationists. And I think everybody sort of understands this implicitly. I keep saying implicitly, but I don't think I'm saying anything new. It's more of just, I'm trying to just, like David Hartley says, it's like he's not a system builder, but it's just kind of aggregating information and trying to talk about it in maybe just a slightly different way, and maybe a slightly, we do this thing as humans is where we want to overcomplicate things. So what I'm trying to do is I'm just trying to think like, what is everything fundamentally? What are the existential issues that we're dealing with as a society? If you want to get all, whatever, deep about it. And so that's kind of what I've been doing. I have a professional interest in this. I won't go into details, but you can just feel free to fact check me on anything, or tell me how I'm wrong. But yeah, I don't really have any expectations for people to listen to this either. But like I said, I'm trying to write something right now, so this is helpful for me at least, and it might be helpful for one or two people, random folks that come across it on the interweb, which is just a big neural network, right? Okay, signing off.